back in this thing with another one. I'm sure a lot of people will love this. It says, our now president vows to scrap income tax.
Bessent is also sounding the alarm on what he calls an impending economic calamity. He is urging lawmakers to extend key provisions of the Trump tax cuts and Jobs Act. The stakes, of course, couldn't be higher. Millions of jobs, billions in lost wages could be lost if the tax cuts expire in December. And Republicans are mobilizing. Speaking at the GOP retreat in Florida, President Trump doubled down on his message, cut taxes for the American people. He even floated the idea of abolishing the federal income tax altogether.
You know, the United States in 1870 to 1913, all tariffs, and that was the richest period in the history of the United States. The income tax came in 1913. As I said in my speech last week, instead of taxing our citizens to enrich foreign nations, we should be tariffing and taxing foreign nations to enrich our citizens.
The president says that he plans to impose...
I'm not going to lie. Personally, hearing it put that way, I think it makes sense. I will say that jumping to impose tariffs is also a risky business, because now you're telling me you're going to charge me tax more on what I'm like, so you don't have to charge the people there. So I can see it going both ways, but hearing him put it that way, I can understand.
Tariffs on a list of imports: steel, aluminum, copper, computer chips, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, all to boost domestic production. This is a very aggressive economic agenda, but it's also really exciting also. Let's just keep with the tariffs for a moment, since that's where we ended. This is a strategy, Brian, that he tried previously. They weren't able to see it through in the last administration. It's one that takes time. He's going back to do it again.
Well, loves tariffs. Tariffs, I think, is his favorite word in the dictionary, he said. Not surprising that he's talking about doing a universal tariff. But I love Kevin Hassett. I think he's my favorite economic guy in the administration, the happy warrior. And he makes such a good point. He says, when these guys talk about tariffs, they ignore all the other policies that we want to do, just like they did in the first Trump term. And if you think back to that term, we got some tariffs, but we got all sorts of supply side pro-growth policies. And that's exactly what the president is talking about now. I mean, folks, he just said, let's eliminate the income tax. Now, I don't know if that's going to get done, but the fact that he's even talking that way tells me this is a guy who does not want to punish work. And that's the biggest thing.
Dagan, what about the federal freeze? That's also huge news today, and Schumer pushing back.
It is big news, and particularly digging into the grant issue. But to stay on the tariff thing, Kenny, so let's connect all the big players in this and what they're saying. Kevin Hassett on Kudlow yesterday said tariffs are not just a weapon, but part of a supply side strategy as part of a tax bill. And Larry Kudlow himself has talked about, let's think about a 10% across the board tariff. We have $5 trillion in imports. And so you're talking about $500 billion to finance tax cuts here. So you are taxing foreign firms, your foreign manufacturers, and then giving individuals, you, and corporations here a tax cut potentially. And then there's the Financial Times article about Scott Bessent saying something that Scott Bessent is pushing for new universal tariffs on U.S. imports starting at 2.5%. This is taking shape. The biggest problem is the Republicans in the House. They control the purse strings. They will be writing this tax reform bill, and there are 48 of them who didn't show up at Doral. What in the hell is wrong with y'all?
Well, speaking of...
I understand her frustration. That is a lot of people who are supposed to be at an event to not show up. And then to be the ones who are majority in control, it does make the other side say, all right, guys, it looks like y'all just want to pull y'all weight around, because you're going to use your majority vote to agree on whatever the issue is. But a majority of you weren't even here to discuss the issue with everybody else. A little bit of favoritism is what it sounds like. But I'm going to just say I feel like we all already knew to expect that.
Taxes, the agenda is very aggressive. He's already talking about bringing the corporate tax rate down, Taylor, not taxing Social Security, overtime, and tips. He wants to extend the 2017 tax cuts, but the CBO says if you do that, it's going to add $4 trillion over a decade to the deficit. So that's a problem. He says it might be offset by the tariffs. What do you think?
You know me. If I'm looking at the bond market, all I can think about is the debt and the deficit and how we tackle this. So the bond vigilantes don't come out and scream at us. So I love that you brought up the deficit. But I think, Jackie, as we've been talking about on the show, those tax cuts have to be number one priority because that was the mandate from the voters. So I think you have to get that done and find revenue elsewhere. Is that revenue a 2.5%, as Dagan mentioned, what Scott Bessent laid out? What's interesting about that in terms of a revenue source is, to me, markets like certainty. So if you tell me 10% tariff, if I'm a company like GM, I can handle that. If you tell me that every month it's going up by 2.5%, I have a hard time planning around that because how do I figure out, do I buy the goods now? What if the tariffs go up? Is it a negotiating tool? Is it going up? And so Scott Bessent is the smartest person in the room. Do not get me wrong. But some of that makes me nervous when you think about just those monthly increments.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up the market and the reaction to it, Kenny. That's where I want to bring.
So pretty much she's saying that, okay, you're telling people they're going to be hit with tariffs. Cool. As a big business who plans 6 months a year in ahead for what we're going to do, it's hard for me to make moves comfortably and watch my capital if you're telling me how much I have to pay you is going to vary month by month. Because what we did last month might not work for us to meet our minimum goal next month when we have to give you more money. And if we go 3 months without buying product, on the 4th month, we've been paying more money than we're used to. So now we're going further out of budget to buy a product for what's in our balances because we didn't account for this change. As someone who has to account for millions and billions of dollars, 2.5% every month is a lot. Over 6 months, that's over 10%. And it started at 10%. So we go 10% and I say, cool. And then 6 months later, we had 20%. Whatever I planned in that original conversation is now null and void. And I have to go back to the drawing board.
And obviously, we had a rough day yesterday. We're dealing with that AI story. That's part of the issue. But the markets have been up since Trump has come into office. Even though we started the year on a little bit of a down note, tells me that investors are very optimistic about this.
I think they're very optimistic. And I hear it when I'm talking to people. I'm very optimistic about what the future holds and what all these policy holds. And actually, this whole idea about eliminating the income tax or redefining it and coming in with, kind of a 10% tariff tax and giving an income tax break to Americans encourages them to work more, in my opinion, encourages them then to spend more, in my opinion. So then you end up having a stronger and better economy. I think the market likes it. I think it's clear. I think yesterday's action in the market was a separate issue.
Yeah.
Although we could say that the market needs to pull back a little bit because maybe it's a little bit stretched, and that's fine. But yesterday's action, I think, was completely a whole different issue.
Allow me to apologize for Woodrow Wilson, fellow Virginian, who was the president who implemented the income tax.
Yeah.
We fully disavow him for many reasons.
Have you ever had an experience?
So there you have it there, man. Even the anchors wasn't really a fan of income tax. I honestly feel like nobody is necessarily a fan of income tax. It's just people understand that it needs to be paid because the money goes towards our schools, our infrastructure. The money goes towards things that are beneficial to society, but it's how much of that is actually going towards benefiting programs. And unfortunately, there's a disparity in wealth, which means there's a disparity in how much your income tax is versus how much a rich person's income tax is. And then once you get into it and you have tax cuts, it just becomes a big, messy game about who's smarter and has the better tax person. I don't know. We'll see. I'm not going to complain, but I also don't know what that holds.